Welcome to LearnHowToQuilt.com. I'm Ann, and today I'll be showing you how to finish up this granny square table runner. In the first video in this series, you learned how to make these granny square blocks. In this video, you'll learn how to add sashing to the blocks and then how to prepare it for quilting. Then you'll see how to stitch blocks together without sashing. You'll also get a quick look at two other methods for adding that last row. If you want to skip ahead to any of these topics, the links can be found below. Hope you stay tuned. For this runner, you'll need 5 granny squares. You'll find a link below to these directions. You'll also find a link to this supply list. Or you can go to LearnHowToQuilt.com and click on Free Patterns, Table Runners. I've used mainly scraps in my quilt, including these white squares and borders, but on this supply sheet, I've listed the yardage for the borders, backing, and binding as one piece of fabric. In the first video in this series, you learned how to make this granny square block. All squares were used to make this block. After sewing everything together, these edges were trimmed down to an 11-inch square. All of the outside edges on these squares are bias edges with lots of bulky seams. It's difficult to sew bias to bias and to match these points with all that bulk. So instead, I'll be adding sashing in between the blocks. This will decrease some of that bulk at these points, and it will eliminate the need to match point to point. There are some problems with this method. For example, I want to use this white. If I put white here, notice you can see through that, and when I press this back, you're going to get a shadow here, but I'm not going to worry about that. You can eliminate that problem by using darker fabric as a sashing and as this outside border. Notice the difference between the two. I can see through this, but I can't see through this darker fabric. If you decide to use sashing that's a different color, you'll notice more of these points get cut off. If you bought 1 3/4 yards of fabric for the backing, the borders, and the binding, instead of folding your fabric and cutting strips on this cross grain, you'll want to cut your strips on this straight of grain fabric. Fold your fabric along the selvage or straight of grain side, and then trim off the selvage edge, and then cut 1.5-inch strips. You'll need 4 of these. Put 3 of these strips aside, and then take one of the strips and cut 4 11-inch sections. These will go between the blocks. Since I used scraps, I was able to cut 4 1.5-inch by 11-inch strips. I'll have to piece together some of the other strips that I need. Make sure the bias edges are on a flat surface and then carefully pin in place. I start off with a lot of pins to make sure the fabric stays in place with minimal stretching. If I see that I don't need so many pins when I start sewing, then the next time I'll use less. It's best to use a stiletto or another sharp object to help feed this through. You don't want to push or pull this. You want to guide it gently. Now there's a lot of bulk here, so I'm going to hold this down just to make sure that doesn't move when I go over it. Here's where all that bulk is. Put a lot of pressure on it to hold it in place. And continue stitching. Some folks like to use a smaller stitch length when sewing on the bias. I haven't found that that makes a big difference. Actually, if anything, I find it harder. I tend to stretch the fabric more when I use a tighter stitch length. But maybe you have better luck with that. Hold that down and push it through. We fold this back, and that looks pretty good. I'm not right up against the point, but I didn't cut those points off. Let me take this to the ironing board and press. I've pinned the next block to the sashing. And I'm going to try with less pins this time. I didn't seem to have a problem when I sewed, and so as long as I hold this bulk in place, I think I'm going to be okay. So let's see how that looks. And it looks like I'm pretty close to getting most of those points. I'm off a little right here, but I notice there's a pressing problem here also. Let me take this over and press. Just a reminder, when you're pressing, you want to press in up, down motions. You don't want to be pushing and pulling back and forth, because that will really stretch out those bias edges. Continue adding each block and then give your runner a good pressing. After all of your blocks have been sewn together and pressed, you're ready to add borders. I had to piece my borders, but if you bought 1 3/4 yards, you'll have 2 strips long enough to cover these sides. Place the strips on top of each other and through the center. Make a mark on the edge and then cut off the excess. Put right sides together. Chances are that both sides of your runner will not measure the same. In a perfect world, they should be about 57 inches long. One side of my runner is shorter than the other. Looks like I only have to ease in about 1/4 inch. You want to make sure that both sides of your runner are the same so that it'll end up being flat and squared. Start pinning on the end and ease in that extra across the side. Stitch the borders in place and then press. To add the ends, measure through the center, cut, and then ease in place. If you'd like more information about squaring up, check out our video. You'll find the link below. After pressing, I cut this backing a few inches longer and wider, which ends up being about 60 inches by 15 inches. Place your backing face down. I like to tape it to hold it in place. Add your batting and then the top. Safety pin the layers together for machine quilting, then finish with binding. You'll find links below to more detailed instructions on this process. I made up these 2 blocks to demonstrate different ways to sew these together. Remember, these are all bias edges, and you're looking to match these points. So if you put right sides together and then pin, and instead of sewing right now, the first thing I'm going to do is hand base this seam. Just going to come down. Don't have to be perfect stitches. As I get closer to these points here, I'm going to really try to get them right up against each other. Continue across. I'm coming to this next spot where they need to match up, and it looks like this needs to be pulled over a little. I'll hold it like that. As I get closer to that spot, I like to put the stitches a little bit closer together to help hold it in place. And then I just stitch to the end. Don't need any pins. Use a stiletto or the tips of your scissors to hold this bulk in place here. putting a lot of pressure on this to keep everything where it's supposed to be. Now I'm just gently guiding this. Okay, so now I'm going to hold this in place again. Take out these stitches, these basting stitches, and here's my 2 blocks meeting at those points. When I press this bias, I want to make sure that I'm not pushing and shoving. The iron needs to go up and down so as not to stretch out this area. If you're overwhelmed by sewing all those bias edges, why not try adding triangles to this last row? Using the formulas for setting triangles, I cut 1 square at 2 inches for these corner triangles. So when I cut that on the diagonal, the straight of grain and cross grain are here and these corners. And so when I add these to my block, I've got the straight of grain and cross grain on the outside edge. For these side triangles, I cut a square 3 3/8 inches, and then I cut it on both diagonals. The straight of grain is along these edges, so when I put that in my block, the straight of grain or cross grain will be all the way around on the edges. Another way to make it a little bit easier to sew these granny squares together is to use longer rectangles. Now this square is 2 inches and this rectangle is 2 by 3. I added an inch to the length. You're just going to sew these in like you did with the squares. You still have to come around and trim the edges, but you'll get what I call a floating square. You're still going to have bias on the edges that you have to worry about, but all of this bulk is now over here, and you don't have to worry about matching these points. So I've marked this ruler here when I cut a whole bunch of these out. So I use this tape as sort of a guideline. Helps me line this block up when I go to cut everything. Hope you decide to try one of these runners. Granny squares are a bit challenging, but a good way to get used to sewing bias edges. They're also a fun way to play around with fabric combinations. Use your experiments to make a quilt, or to try out different layouts. If granny squares appear to be too challenging, but you like the look, check out our videos on this around the world block. It's not set on point, so you're just sewing squares on the straight of grain and cross grain. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and share our videos with your friends. Thanks.